Hello and welcome to the Underappreciated Animals podcast with Hatchling Makes, an animal-themed podcast filled with fun facts about species which aren't always the main feature in nature documentaries but are getting a chance in the spotlight because they are amazing and they deserve some attention too. My name is Tash and I am a wildlife artist and lifelong animal lover. I run a small business called Hatchling Makes where I sell wildlife-inspired enamel pins and stickers, and every sale helps to raise money for wildlife conservation. In each episode of this show, I will be chatting about a different underappreciated animal, from horseshoe crabs to cassowaries to rock hyraxes and everything in between. I'll be sharing fun facts and telling you all about these incredible species, from where they're found to what they eat to just what makes them so special. Before we go any further, I do want to add in a tiny disclaimer. I am not a wildlife professional in any way, shape, or form. I am just an extreme animal lover, but I will do my very best to research these creatures to the best of my abilities so I can bring you their stories as accurately as possible. So without further ado, let's dive on into today's episode. Whew. First episode nerves. Before we get into this episode, I just wanted to say thank you so much for tuning in and for listening. I know that you have your pick of the podcasts, and for you to have chosen this one really means a lot to me. I don't want to get too sentimental too early into this, so let's dive on into our first episode of the show, and today we are shining a spotlight on the aardvark. Now, you may be thinking, why are we starting off this podcast with an episode about aardvarks? Well, when I was thinking about which animal I should do first, I thought about highlighting my favorite animal, but let's be honest, that's a long list. And then I thought maybe I should focus on the most endangered animal in the world, but I felt like that would have been a really heavy topic to start this podcast off with. So instead we are going with the aardvark, and it's because aardvark is the first word in the English dictionary. And to quote The Sound of Music, let's start at the very beginning. It is a very good place to start after all. So in today's episode, we're going to cover everything to do with aardvarks, where they live, what they eat, how big they get, all that kind of stuff, with some fun facts thrown in here and there. So let's get cracking. Now, if you've never seen an aardvark, then describing one is pretty tricky because it's sort of a mishmash of a bunch of animals put together. And if you're thinking, oh, I know what an aardvark looks like, I've seen Arthur, well, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but Arthur looks nothing like an actual aardvark. Absolutely nothing against Arthur. I'm sure it's a great TV show, but the animators definitely took some artistic licenses with designing. An actual aardvark has got a sort of a long pig-like snout and then ears of a rabbit, and then their body is almost hairless and they have a really thick skin and it's shaped a little bit like a pig, and then they have a long tail that's kind of reminiscent of a kangaroo. Now, if you're listening to this and going, this sounds so weird, Tash, I can't picture this at all, then I do have my own illustration of an aardvark, which is the artwork for this episode if you want to go see what they really look like. So hopefully now you've got an idea of how they look like. Honestly, I think they're so charming and they're so interesting to look at. I could spend ages talking about what they look like because I just think that they're super cute. Now, aardvarks are pretty big animals. They can grow up to about 110 to 135 centimeters long, and that's not including the tail. That's about 43 to 53 inches, so that's pretty big. Weight-wise, they come in at about 40 to 80 kg, which is about 110 to 180 pounds. So for comparison, an average domestic house cat is 4 to 5 kg, which is about 8 to 10 pounds. That means you need about 16 house cats for every aardvark. I really hope I've done the math right there. Math is not my strong suit. So aardvarks are pretty hefty animals, and that always throws me because in my head I imagine them to be really cute, really small, like a bit more like a meerkat, and then you see them and they're actually pretty massive. I mean, we're not talking like the size of an elephant or the size of a whale, but not the size that you imagine an aardvark to be when you imagine one in your head. And don't get me wrong, I still think that they're really cute, but I think because we only see them when we go to zoos, so not that often, at least not as often as I would like, or we only see them in nature documentaries, so we don't really get an idea of the actual scale of these animals sometimes. So I'm going to throw in a little fun fact here. I love a good fun fact. So this one is that the name aardvark is actually an Afrikaans word which means earth pig, and when you look at an aardvark, it's just the most apt name for it because it's not quite a pig, but it's not quite anything else, and so I don't know, it just fits. Now, if you're wanting to go and see one of these adorable creatures in the wild, then you need to head to Africa. Aardvarks are found in grasslands and in bushlands, and actually in loads of different habitats, but all in sub-Saharan Africa. And if you didn't know what that means, it's basically anything below the Sahara Desert. So if you imagine a map of Africa and then about a quarter of the way down draw an imaginary line, and then everything below that line is where you could potentially find an aardvark. And then when you think about it, then aardvarks having those big, long, rabbity ears makes a lot of sense because they live in such a dry and hot climate. And so similar to the fennec fox, they can use those ears to dispel and get rid of their excess body heat to keep themselves cool. So one of the coolest things about aardvarks, and this is another little fun fact for you, is that they have really strong claws on their two front feet. And they kind of form little spades, which they can then use to dig. And so they're really great diggers, and they can dig really elaborate burrows, which have got long tunnels and separate sleeping chambers and massive entrances and everything. And then that digging skill comes in really useful when they need to hide from predators, so they can dig and hide themselves in the ground really quickly. So if an aardvark is threatened, it can just dig down and then vanish. So let's just jump back into the burrows, because I find this really interesting. And I feel like I've said everything is really interesting so far, but I really do find this so fascinating. I'm going to guess that because you've gotten 5 minutes into this podcast and you feel the same way, so yay! So aardvarks dig new burrows pretty regularly, and then they abandon their old burrows. But then their abandoned burrows are used by other animals as shelter, which I personally think is just like the epitome of the whole animal kingdom, because everything depends on something else and it all works together, and I just find this so amazing. So warthogs and hyenas and snakes and all sorts of birds and lizards and even pangolins have been found to repurpose old abandoned aardvark burrows. I mean, imagine coming across an aardvark burrow, but then there's actually a hyena inside there. Like, it just blows my mind a little. And actually, this is a really important fact because it means that the aardvark is classed as a keystone species because it has such a wide impact on the natural environment and on the ecosystem. So without aardvarks digging these burrows, that would make lives really difficult for these other animals. In fact, I was just watching a documentary about a leopard that was chasing a family of warthogs, and the warthogs took refuge in an abandoned aardvark burrow. And it was just so interesting to watch. These warthogs survived, and they were able to hide in the burrow and then dash out and run off before the leopard could catch them. And even though the leopard was staking out the burrow, I mean, it was just so fascinating to watch this documentary and to see warthogs using aardvark burrows in this way, even though I did feel a little bit bad for the leopard, but I was really pleased that the warthogs would be able to hide and then get away safely at the end. It was just such a heartwarming moment. It was so lovely. Anyways, I digress. Now I found one single article on the Edge of Extinction website, which is the home of EDGE, and it was an article written in 2012. And if you don't know what EDGE stands for, it stands for evolutionarily... Ooh, I can't say that word. Evolutionarily... Nope, I can't. Distinct and globally endangered. They're basically species that are broken off the evolutionary tree so long ago and forged their own path, and so they have very few to no close relatives. So if these species were to go extinct, we would lose them forever. So a great example of this is the vaquita dolphin. It's just totally unique. So the article said that aardvarks were the world's most evolutionarily, I said it that time, distinct mammal with the highest score on the scale of how EDGE classifies how distinct an animal is. But I couldn't confirm this information anywhere else. I could only find it written in this one article, and I couldn't find aardvarks in the EDGE database of animals anywhere, under mammals or under focal species. I just couldn't find them. Now, normally, if I can't confirm information, I just wouldn't mention it, but if aardvarks are an EDGE species, then that's a really important fact to know. So if you are listening to this and if you have any sources that aardvarks are an EDGE species other than the Edge of Existence website, please let me know, get in touch, because I love to highlight EDGE species and I think it is super important to mention whenever there is an EDGE species because, again, if we were to lose these animals, we would lose them forever. What we do know for sure is that aardvarks are the only member of their scientific family, which I will not be pronouncing here because I can't and I don't want to butcher the pronunciation like I did earlier. We also know that there is only one species of aardvark and that their closest relatives are thought to be dugongs, hyraxes, and elephants. And that is according to the excellent Animal Diversity Web, which, side note, I discovered thanks to Ellen and Christian Weatherford from the Just the Zoo of Us podcast. So go listen to them. They're great. And they are one of the inspirations for me starting this podcast. So yeah, make sure you go give them a listen. So aardvarks are mammals and they give birth to one pup at a time, but they're also nocturnal, and because of that there's not a lot known about their mating behaviors. What we do know is that they are fairly solitary animals unless they are a mum raising a young. So baby aardvarks stay in burrows for about 2 weeks before they start going out to forage for food, and that brings us quite nicely onto what does an aardvark eat. Aardvarks are insectivores, and they mostly eat ants and termites, and they have a very long, sticky tongue, a bit like an anteater or a pangolin. And then they use those spade-like claws that we were talking about earlier to tear open termite mounds. And they don't hang around when they do that. They can dig 2 foot in about 15 seconds. 2 foot is about half a meter. I can imagine that for a termite, that's a pretty terrifying thing to have happen to you. Your home is destroyed, and then before you can process what's happening, you've been eaten by an aardvark. So yeah, amazing fact about aardvarks, but not so great if you are a termite. Whilst I was researching aardvarks for this episode, I came across a website called the African Wildlife Foundation, and they said that aardvarks will sometimes just push their snout up against the opening in a termite's nest and just sort of slurp up the termites. Now, I don't know how accurate that is, but if I was an aardvark, that's probably something I would do. I imagine it a little like an aardvark who can't be bothered to tear open the termite mound. Like, I'll just stick my nose into the hole and have a little snack. Like fast food, but for aardvarks. I mean, I can see the appeal. So I wanted to talk a little about the conservation status of aardvarks. Now, they are classified as least concern on the IUCN Red List, and that is because they have a fairly stable population. And actually, in protected areas, like in national parks, they have really thriving populations, which is amazing. But that doesn't mean that they don't face threats, and sadly, like a lot of animals that I'm going to highlight in this show, those threats generally are because of human interaction. So farmers don't particularly like aardvarks because they dig their burrows, and obviously that leaves holes everywhere. So they have been known to kill aardvarks sometimes, but then that causes the termite populations to then explode and then destroy the farmers' crops. So it's a bit like karma. Aardvarks are also hunted by humans and are considered a food source. Now, this is not the type of podcast where we are going to criticize local cultures or beliefs. This is just a sad fact. Unfortunately, aardvarks are hunted for food. Aardvarks also have natural predators like hyenas, lions, and leopards as well. And then on top of all of that, if the aardvarks have managed to avoid being hunted, being killed because they're considered pests, being prey for other larger animals, they are also suffering from a loss of their own prey. Ants and termite populations can be victim to pesticide use, which obviously then impacts aardvarks because they can't eat. So even though populations are stable, to sort of semi-quote Kermit the Frog, it ain't easy being an aardvark. And so on that note, I'm going to wrap this episode up here. I hope you've enjoyed hearing me rambling on about aardvarks. Honestly, they are one of my favorite animals. But if you know me or you followed my work for a long time, you'll know that I say that a lot. Thank you so much for listening to my first ever full podcast episode. Until next time, take care, folks. Thank you so much for listening to the Underappreciated Animals podcast. I hope you found this episode fun and interesting, and if you did, then please reach out, let me know. I would love to hear from you. If you love animals and you would like to help support this podcast, you can check out my website for my small business, Hatchling Makes, which you can find at hatchlingmakes.com, or if you head to the show notes, I'll leave a link there. It's got wildlife-inspired enamel pins and stickers and stationery and all that good stuff. Plus 10% of every sale is donated to wildlife conservation. Also, if you have a moment to leave me a review, I would be super grateful. That really helps me to know that I am sharing the animal stories that you want to hear. You can also discover more underappreciated animals by listening to the other episodes, which are available wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to subscribe whilst you're there so you don't miss out on any future episodes. New episodes will come out every other week on a Friday. I'm also taking animal suggestions, so hop on over into the show notes to find out how to do that if you have an animal you'd like me to highlight on the show. Bonus points if you mention one that I have never heard of before. That's all from me. Until next time, take care, folks.